The German panzer commander couldn't make sense of what he was seeing through his periscope. American Sherman tanks rolling toward his position in the Norman countryside, each one carrying massive logs strapped to their hulls like crude armor. He'd seen desperate men do strange things in war, but this looked like madness. The Shermans were already outmatched by his Tiger, and now they were weighing themselves down with timber. He almost felt sorry for them. Then he watched one of those Shermans drive straight into a bomb crater, tip forward at an impossible angle, and do something that made his blood run cold. The crew released those logs, jammed them under their own treads, and the 30-ton machine clawed its way out of the hole like it had grown legs. In that moment, the German officer realized he wasn't fighting amateurs anymore. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Lieutenant Marcus Dalton had been in France for exactly 17 days when he first saw the logs. It was late June in 1944, and the hedgerow country of Normandy had turned into a nightmare maze that swallowed tanks whole. The morning fog still clung to the fields when Sergeant Frank Kowalski approached his Sherman with two enormous logs balanced on his shoulder, each one maybe 10 feet long and thick as a man's torso. Marcus was drinking terrible instant coffee from his canteen cup, trying to wake up enough to face another day of this grinding warfare that nobody back in training had adequately prepared them for. "Sir, permission to modify the tank," Frank said without preamble. He was a stocky man from Pittsburgh who'd worked in his father's lumber yard before the war, and he had the kind of practical intelligence that came from solving real problems with real materials. Marcus looked at the logs, then at Frank, then back at the logs. "Sergeant, unless you're planning to build us a cabin out here, I'm not sure what you have in mind." "Traction, sir. Mobile support." Frank set the logs down and pulled out a rough sketch he had made on the back of a ration wrapper. "We strap these to the hull with cables. When we hit soft ground or a crater, we release them under the treads. Instant bridge, instant traction. I've seen it work with smaller vehicles back home when they get stuck in snow or mud." Marcus had been about to dismiss it as just another of the dozens of field modifications soldiers were constantly suggesting, most of them useless or dangerous. But something in Frank's tone made him pause. The sergeant wasn't grandstanding or trying to show off. He was solving a problem, the same problem that had cost them 2 tanks in the past week. They'd lost those Shermans not to enemy fire, but to the terrain itself. Machines tipping into craters and ditches they couldn't climb out of, becoming sitting targets for German anti-tank guns. "Show me how it works," Marcus said. Within an hour, Frank had rigged up a demonstration using one of the spare logs. He'd found heavy cable in the engineering supplies, the kind meant for towing damaged vehicles, and he'd created a quick-release mechanism using carabiners and a pull cord that the tank commander could operate from inside the turret. The elegance of it impressed Marcus. It wasn't sophisticated engineering, but it didn't need to be. It was the kind of innovation born from necessity, from men who'd grown up fixing tractors and cars and learning to make do with whatever was at hand. "The Germans think we're soft," Frank said as he tightened the last cable. "Rich American boys who don't know how to work with our hands. Let them think that. Meanwhile, we'll be driving through terrain they can't follow us into." Marcus approved the modification, and by that afternoon, his entire platoon of 5 Shermans had logs strapped to their hulls. The other tank commanders thought it looked ridiculous. Captain Reynolds, who commanded the company, came by personally to inspect what he called Dalton's carpentry project. "You planning to open a lumber yard in France, Lieutenant?" Reynolds asked, though his tone wasn't entirely mocking. There was curiosity there, too. Reynolds was old Army, regular Army from before the war. But he wasn't stupid. He'd seen enough combat in North Africa to know that survival often came down to improvisation. "Planning to keep my tanks mobile, sir," Marcus replied. "The Bocage country is eating us alive. We need an edge." Reynolds walked around one of the modified Shermans, studying the cable rigging and the quick-release mechanism Frank had devised. "And if this doesn't work, if those logs jam up your treads instead of helping, then we'll look like idiots, sir. But we'll be alive idiots with functioning tanks." The captain's weathered face cracked into something that might have been a smile. "Carry on, Lieutenant, but if this works, I want every tank in the battalion rigged the same way by next week." The first real test came 3 days later during a push toward the village of Saint-Laurent. Intelligence had reported light German resistance, which in Marcus's experience meant they were about to walk into hell. The attack began at dawn, 5 Shermans moving in a loose formation across fields that had been farmland until artillery had turned them into moonscapes of overlapping craters and torn earth. Private Danny Chen was driving Marcus's tank, a kid from San Francisco who'd learned to drive on the steep hills of that city and who had reflexes like a cat. He called out obstacles over the intercom in his usual calm way, never panicking even when shells started landing around them. "Crater ahead, big one," Danny reported. "Looks about 8 feet deep. Want to go around?" Marcus was about to order exactly that when he remembered the logs. Going around would add precious minutes to their advance, and might expose them to the German anti-tank gun that intelligence insisted wasn't there, but which Marcus knew damn well was lurking somewhere in the hedgerows ahead. "Negative, take us straight in. Prepare to deploy logs on my mark." He could feel the tension in his crew. Bobby Hernandez on the 75mm gun muttered something that might have been a prayer. Ray Johnson, the loader, went very still in the way men do when they're bracing for impact. Frank, serving as gunner that day, just said quietly, "Ready when you are, sir." The Sherman nosed over the lip of the crater, and suddenly they were falling, 30 tons of steel tipping forward at an angle that sent equipment sliding and had everyone grabbing for handholds. Danny threw the transmission into reverse, but the treads just spun uselessly, chewing at empty air. They were stuck, exactly the situation that had killed 2 crews last week. "Deploy logs now," Marcus ordered, pulling the release cord. There was a metallic clang as the cables released and the logs dropped. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then Danny worked the controls again, and the treads caught the timber, found purchase, and the Sherman lurched forward. The logs acted like temporary ramps, bridges the tank laid for itself across the gap. Metal ground against wood with a sound like 1,000 violins being strangled, but they were moving, climbing, clawing their way up the far side of the crater. They emerged back onto level ground, with both logs still intact, dragging beneath the treads until Danny stopped and Frank could jump out to retrieve and re-secure them. The whole evolution took maybe 90 seconds. The other 4 Shermans, watching from safer positions, immediately converged on the crater and crossed it using the same method. What could have been a disaster, what should have cost them at least 1 tank, had become just another obstacle overcome. "I'll be damned," Captain Reynolds said over the radio. "Dalton, remind me to never doubt your carpentry skills again." But it was the German response that really confirmed they were onto something. 2 days later, an intelligence officer showed Marcus some intercepted German communications. The enemy was reporting that American tanks were employing a new type of bridge-laying equipment, some kind of rapid deployment system that allowed them to cross obstacles previously thought impassable. They were trying to figure out if it was a new secret weapon, some classified technology rushed from the States. "They think it's some kind of miracle," the intelligence officer said, barely containing his amusement. "They don't realize you're just using logs and common sense." Word spread fast through the American forces in Normandy. Within 2 weeks, half the Sherman tanks in the sector were carrying logs. Engineers started refining the system, developing better quick-release mechanisms and testing different types of timber. Oak worked best because it could take the tremendous pressure of a tank's weight without splintering immediately, though in a pinch any hardwood would do. Some crews carried 2 logs, others carried 4. A few enterprising mechanics even created hydraulic release systems, though most stuck with Frank's simple cable and carabiner method because it was reliable and could be fixed in the field with basic tools. The Germans adapted too, of course. They started targeting tanks with logs specifically, thinking they were command vehicles or carried special equipment. That backfired when they realized every 3rd American tank was sporting the modification. They tried blocking routes with deeper craters and more complex obstacles, but that just forced American combat engineers to get more creative with the log deployments. Marcus's platoon pushed deeper into Normandy throughout July. The fighting was brutal, the kind of close-quarters hell where tanks engaged each other at ranges measured in dozens of yards rather than hundreds. The hedgerows turned every field into a separate battle, every advance a risk. But the logs kept working, kept giving them that edge of mobility that made the difference between completing a mission and becoming a burning wreck. On the 12th of July, they took a village called La Chapelle in a firefight that lasted 6 hours. Marcus's Sherman took 2 hits from a German anti-tank gun, both rounds deflecting off the angled armor in what the crew later agreed was pure luck. During the retreat to regroup, they drove through a collapsed barn that dumped half a roof onto their tank. The logs, still strapped to the hull, actually helped scrape off the debris as they powered through. It wasn't what Frank had designed them for, but it worked anyway. Private Chen started calling the logs their good luck charms. Bobby Hernandez carved names into them like they were crew members, dubbing them Lefty and Righty. Even Captain Reynolds, who'd initially been skeptical, ordered his own tank fitted with the modification after watching Marcus's platoon navigate terrain that should have stopped them cold. But it was the encounter with the Tiger tank that really drove home the value of the innovation. It happened on a gray morning in late July when the rain had turned the roads into rivers of mud. Marcus's platoon was supporting an infantry advance when they came around a hedgerow and found themselves face to face with a German Tiger, the most feared tank in the European theater. The Tiger's 88mm gun could punch through a Sherman's armor like it was cardboard, and everyone in Marcus's crew knew it. The German tank fired first, the round passing so close to their turret that Marcus felt the displacement of air. Danny threw the Sherman into reverse and steered hard left, trying to get to cover, but the mud betrayed them. The tank's rear left tread broke through the crust of the road and sank into soft ground underneath, the whole machine tilting sickeningly as it threatened to bog down completely. "We're stuck," Danny called out, and Marcus could hear the edge of panic in the usually calm driver's voice. The Tiger was traversing its turret toward them, taking its time because it knew they were helpless. "Logs," Frank said sharply. "Sir, the logs. We can use them for traction in the mud." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Deploy both now." The logs dropped into the mud beneath their treads. Danny gunned the engine, and the Sherman lurched forward just as the Tiger fired again. The round hit the ground where they'd been seconds before, throwing up a geyser of mud and stones. The logs gave them just enough purchase to scramble around the hedgerow and into a defensive position where their own 75mm gun could engage. They didn't kill the Tiger. It was too heavily armored for that. But they landed 2 hits that damaged its tracks, immobilizing it long enough for American tank destroyers to move up and finish the job. After the battle, the Tiger's crew was captured, and one of the German tankers couldn't stop staring at the logs on Marcus's Sherman. "This is your secret?" he asked in accented English. "Wood? Just wood?" Frank, who was resecuring the logs for the next advance, looked up with a grin. "Just wood," he confirmed, "and Americans who know how to use it." The German shook his head in disbelief, or maybe respect. "We have been reporting that you possess new bridging equipment, rapid deployment systems. Command thought perhaps American industry had developed something revolutionary." He laughed, a bitter sound. "All this time, it was logs." "Sometimes the simple answer is the right answer," Marcus said. He didn't add that sometimes being underestimated was an advantage all its own. As the summer of 1944 wore on and the Allies broke out of Normandy, the log modification became standard across American armored units. Engineers wrote it up in field manuals. Photographers documented it for training purposes, and maintenance crews started carrying spare timber specifically for tank modifications. What had begun as one sergeant's bright idea had evolved into standard operating procedure, but the real validation came when other armies started copying it. British tank crews began strapping logs to their Cromwell and Churchill tanks. Even some Soviet units, who'd been dealing with their own mobility challenges in the swamps and forests of Eastern Europe, adopted variations of the technique. The Germans, for all their engineering sophistication and their superior tank designs, found themselves playing catch-up to a field modification made with basic lumber and cable. Marcus's crew made it all the way to the German border by December. They had lost Lefty, the original left-side log, to a direct hit from a Panzerfaust in Belgium, and Righty had been replaced 3 times due to wear and damage. But the system itself never failed them. Every time they needed it, whether crossing a crater or pulling themselves out of mud, the logs performed exactly as Frank had predicted they would. On Christmas Eve, they were bivouacked in a captured German town, whose name Marcus could never remember later. Snow was falling, the first real snow of the winter, and someone had found a bottle of wine in a cellar. The crew sat in their Sherman, engine running to provide heat, and passed the bottle around while they talked about home and what they'd do when the war finally ended. "I'm going back to the lumber yard," Frank said when it was his turn to share. "Gonna work with my old man again, But I'll tell you what, I'll never look at a stack of timber the same way. Before the war, wood was just wood. Now, every log I see, I think about how many uses it might have that nobody's thought of yet. Danny Chen, who'd been quiet most of the evening, spoke up. My dad always said the best tools are the ones you can understand. He's a mechanic, works on cars, and he says the problem with modern stuff is it's too complicated. When something breaks, you need a specialist. But these logs, he gestured at the timber still strapped to their hull outside. Anyone can understand them. Anyone can fix them. That's good engineering. Bobby Hernandez raised the wine bottle in a toast. To simple solutions, and to Frank for thinking of it before we all got killed in a ditch somewhere. They drank to that, and Marcus thought about the strange way that warfare drove innovation. There were plenty of complex, sophisticated weapons in this war, from radar to proximity fuses to the early computers being used to break enemy codes. But here they were, celebrating a modification that might as well have been invented in the Stone Age. Logs, just logs. And yet, it had saved their lives more times than he could count. The war moved into 1945, and Marcus's unit crossed the Rhine in March. By then, the log modification was so common that replacement crews coming from the States already knew about it, had trained with it back home. What had been field improvisation had become doctrine, written into manuals and taught at Fort Knox alongside everything else tankers needed to know. They were in Bavaria when the war in Europe finally ended in May. Marcus's Sherman, battered and scarred from nearly a year of combat, still had its logs. They'd been replaced countless times, patched and repaired, and eventually swapped out entirely, but the system remained. Those lengths of timber had become as much a part of the tank as the gun or the armor. After the surrender, during the long weeks of occupation duty while they waited for orders to redeploy to the Pacific, Marcus ran into a British officer who'd commanded a tank unit in the push through Germany. They got to talking about the war over drinks in a requisitioned German officers' club, sharing stories the way soldiers do when the fighting's done, and it's finally safe to process what they'd been through. "Your logs," the British officer said at one point, already slightly drunk. "Brilliant bit of improvisation, that. We'd been dealing with the same problems, tanks getting stuck, losing mobility, and here you chaps solved it with lumber and cable. Sometimes I think the Americans win wars not because you have better equipment, but because you're willing to try anything if it might work." Marcus thought about that for a moment. "I think it's because we don't always know what the proper way is supposed to be. We're not professional soldiers, most of us, not really. We're farmers and factory workers and guys who ran hardware stores. So, when we see a problem, we solve it the way we'd solve any problem back home. We improvise. We make do." "Well, it works," the British officer said. "After the war, I suspect your log trick will end up in training manuals for every army in the world. That's how innovation spread. Someone has a bright idea in the field. It keeps people alive, and pretty soon it's standard procedure everywhere." He was right, of course. In the decades after World War II, the technique of using logs for traction and mobility became standard practice for armored units operating in difficult terrain. Tank crews in Korea used it, adapting the method for the mountainous conditions there. Vietnam saw American and South Vietnamese units employing similar techniques in the jungle and rice paddies. By the time modern armies began using composite materials and advanced engineering solutions, the basic principle remained the same: give your vehicle something to grip onto, create your own traction when the ground fails. Frank Kowalski went back to Pittsburgh after the war and did exactly what he'd said he would: return to his father's lumber yard. He never talked much about the war with customers or even with his family, but his children grew up hearing the story of the logs from other veterans who'd come through the yard over the years, men who'd served with him, who remembered the innovation that had saved their lives in the mud and craters of Normandy. Danny Chen opened a garage in San Francisco, specializing in foreign cars that most American mechanics didn't understand yet. He had a photograph on his wall, a grainy black and white shot of their Sherman with its logs strapped to the hull, and when curious customers asked about it, he'd tell them about the strange geometry of warfare, how sometimes the simplest tools were the most effective. Bobby Hernandez became a teacher, taught history to high school students in New Mexico. He used the log story in his classes when discussing innovation and problem solving, how necessity breeds invention, and how the best ideas often come from unexpected places. His students growing up in the age of space exploration and computers were always surprised to learn that their grandparents' generation had revolutionized tank warfare with lumber. Marcus Dalton stayed in the Army, made a career of it. He retired as a colonel in 1972 and wrote a memoir that included a chapter about the logs. The chapter was called Simple Solutions, and in it, he argued that modern military thinking sometimes got too caught up in technological sophistication, forgetting that combat effectiveness often came down to basic principles applied creatively. The German panzer commander, who'd first seen those log-equipped Shermans through his periscope and thought the Americans were crazy, survived the war too. He ended up teaching at a military academy in the new West German Army, and he used the story of the American logs as a cautionary tale. Don't underestimate your enemy, he'd tell his students. Don't assume that simple means ineffective. And never ever think that superior equipment alone will win a war. Years later, military historians studying World War II identified the log modification as one of several hundred field innovations that collectively gave the Allies an edge in the European theater. Not the atomic bomb, or the P-51 Mustang, or the Higgins boat, but logs, timber. The kind of solution a lumberman's son from Pittsburgh could dream up, because he understood materials and forces and practical problem solving. In the end, that might have been the real genius of it. The logs weren't secret technology or classified engineering. They were available to anyone, understandable by anyone, replicable by anyone, with basic tools and materials. They democratized mobility, turned a weakness of the Sherman tank into something that could be overcome with resources that existed everywhere. There were trees. The modification spread beyond just American forces during the war. Resistance fighters in France and Italy, getting their hands on captured or abandoned tanks, learned about the logs and used them. Some Soviet tank crews, hearing about the technique through intelligence reports or captured prisoners, adopted their own versions. By 1945, you could find log-equipped tanks on every front in Europe. All of them descended from that first field modification Frank Kowalski had jury-rigged in a Norman field. There's a museum in France now, near the Normandy beaches, that has a restored Sherman tank with authentic log modifications on display. Tour guides tell visitors about the innovation, about how American ingenuity turned a simple material into a tactical advantage. School children on field trips touch the rough wood and try to imagine what it was like to be inside that tank. 30 tons of steel grinding across a war-torn landscape, with nothing but logs and courage standing between life and death. The logs became more than just a tactical modification. They became a symbol of a certain approach to warfare. A philosophy that valued practical innovation over rigid doctrine. When military planners in later decades designed new vehicles or weapon systems, they'd sometimes invoke the log story as a reminder to stay flexible, to listen to the people actually doing the fighting, to remember that the best ideas often come from the ground level rather than from headquarters. Frank never got a medal for his innovation, no formal recognition beyond a letter of commendation that ended up in a file somewhere. But he didn't need one. The real reward was in the letters he'd receive occasionally over the years, from men who'd served in different units, different theaters even, who'd used the log technique and credited it with saving their lives. Each letter said essentially the same thing. Thank you for thinking of it. Thank you for sharing it. Thank you for giving us an edge when we needed it most. On the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, a group of veterans gathered in Normandy for a reunion. Frank was there, 80 years old, but still strong, still recognizable as the practical-minded sergeant who'd solved a problem with lumber. Someone had arranged for a restored Sherman to be present, complete with authentic log modifications, and the veterans spent an afternoon around it, trading stories and remembering friends who hadn't made it home. A young French reporter asked Frank what he thought about when he looked at those logs now, 50 years later. He was quiet for a long moment, one weathered hand resting on the timber that was strapped to the tank's hull exactly as it would have been in 1944. I think about how lucky we were, he finally said. Not lucky that the logs worked, though that helped. Lucky that we were in an army that let a sergeant with an idea try it out. Lucky that officers like Lieutenant Dalton were willing to take a chance on something unconventional. Lucky that we were fighting for a country that valued innovation and improvisation, that didn't just tell us to follow the manual and keep quiet. He paused, looking at the other veterans gathered around, seeing in their aged faces the young men they'd been when they'd crossed the Atlantic to fight in someone else's country for principles they believed in. The logs were just wood, Frank continued, but what they represented was bigger than that. They represented the idea that good ideas can come from anywhere, that problems can be solved if you're willing to think differently, that sometimes the answer you need is right in front of you if you're just willing to see it. That's the real story here. Not the logs themselves, but what they meant about us, about the kind of people we were and the kind of army we had. The reporter wrote down every word, and that quote ended up in newspapers around the world. It resonated with people, that simple philosophy that innovation and courage and practical thinking could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The story of the logs became part of the larger narrative of World War II, one of countless small victories that added up to the larger triumph. In military colleges and academies today, the log modification is still taught as a case study in field innovation. Engineering students study the mechanics of it, how the distribution of weight and the friction coefficients made it work. Leadership classes examine how the idea spread through the Army, how innovation can be encouraged or stifled depending on organizational culture. History students learn it as part of the broader story of the war, one thread among millions in the vast tapestry of that conflict. But maybe the best legacy of the logs is simpler than all that academic analysis. It's in the lesson they teach about human ingenuity, about our capacity to adapt and overcome. When faced with a problem, we can fold, or we can find a solution. When conventional answers fail, we can give up, or we can try something unconventional. The logs represented that choice, that determination to find a way forward no matter what. The Germans who'd opposed those Sherman tanks in Normandy, who'd seen the logs and couldn't believe something so simple could be so effective, learned that lesson too. In their own ways, in their own armies after the war, they carried forward the understanding that war isn't just about having the best equipment or the most sophisticated technology. It's about having people who can think, adapt, solve problems on the fly. That's what those logs represented in the summer of 1944, and what they still represent today whenever the story is told. They weren't a miracle weapon or a secret technology. They were just logs, just timber, just wood. But in the hands of people who refused to accept defeat, who looked at a problem and saw a solution, who were willing to try something new even if it looked ridiculous, those simple logs became something more. They became proof that sometimes the best answer to a complex problem is elegantly simple. That innovation doesn't always require laboratories or engineering degrees or massive budgets. That courage and creativity and a willingness to take chances can triumph over superior equipment and rigid thinking. That's the story of the American tanks carrying logs through Normandy. And it's a story worth remembering not just for what happened then, but for what it teaches us now. The logs are gone now, rotted away decades ago, or preserved in museums behind glass. The men who strapped them to tanks are mostly gone too, passed away into history like the war itself. But the lesson remains, carved as deeply into our collective memory as Bobby Hernandez once carved names into those lengths of oak timber. When you face an obstacle that seems too big to overcome, when the conventional solutions have all failed, when everyone tells you that what you're trying is impossible, remember the logs. Remember Frank Kowalski looking at a problem and seeing an answer. Remember Marcus Dalton willing to take a chance on an unconventional idea. Remember all those tank crews who trusted in simple materials and practical thinking to carry them through hell. Sometimes the answer you're looking for isn't complicated. Sometimes it's just waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough or creative enough to see it. Sometimes all you need is logs and the courage to use them.